Hello guys and welcome to another quick review. So again, this is about BMW S1000RR model year 2018. Same applies to 15 model, pretty much same bike. Again, the DDC geometry and the suspension. So in my previous video I explained how I managed to install a front sensor from 2D, which connects to the stock wiring. So the front end now controlled by DDC completely, so it's fully active suspension now, without this sensor like hitting the radiator, and it would allow the lock, full lock of the steering, so you can lock the bike properly, so you don't need this rubber dampers, which would limit the steering angle. So the sensor is mounted lower comparing to what the stock, let's say, mounting kit allows. So that includes the drilling of a little hole in here and then making a thread for the bottom mount of a sensor, and the rest of the parameters are exactly as per their manual, 412 millimeters from bottom end to the top end of a sensor on fully extended suspension. So all of that is done. So what I learned about it, so after installing the sensor actually. So before installing the sensor, the front seems to be too soft. So I had to add a lot of a preload and raise the bikes on the forks in the front so it would steer properly, with front being so soft. And also on the hard braking, it was squashing quite a lot. So all of that disappears when I installed the front sensor, and with the geometry changes I had in the rear, like lowering the rear and raising the front through the shock eccentrics and the rest of the methods. So all of that rendered the bike running wide on the corner exits. So what I decided, and also in the front I had to run more rebound damping on zero and less compression damping, something like -4 or -5 on the compression, +2 or 3 on the rebound or something like that. But anyway, that wasn't still wasn't good enough for me. So I decided to reset the bike to all the stock settings in terms of the preload and geometry. So I put in back the stock eccentric and the shock over here, top shock mount in a stock position, 1.5 millimeter, hold down. This is how it's supposed to be. I replaced the rod which I modified with a stock rod length, the rod which connects the swing arm and the sensor in the rear. I put the put the forks into the stock position, which is 5 millimeters, including the cap, like from here to here, 5 millimeters, right? Or that renders 260 millimeters from the bottom of the golden tube to the lower triple clamp. So I did that. So now the whole geometry of a bike as it would be by the service manual of a BMW for this model year, and that applies again to 2015 as well. So again, you still need to tighten all the bolts, and they specifically say that in the service manual, that all the bolts of a rear suspension needs to be tightened when there is a load on the rear wheel. So I still recommend to loosen all the bolts and tighten them when the bike is sitting on a side stand. That includes 2 shock bolts and 3 bolts of a swing arm linkage. One which connects swing arm linkage to the frame, one which connects the swing arm linkage to swing arm itself, and one which connects the triangle of a linkage to linkage rods. So after doing all of that, I went to the BMW dealership and reset the zero position of a sensor. And service manual specifies 2 methods. So one method when the bike is sitting on a side stand, another method when the bike is sitting on its own weight without rider applied. And this is what I did this time. So last time I tried with a bike sitting on a side stand, this time I tried with a bike sitting on its own weight. Again, all the preload of the rear shock and the forks were taken out. And this provided even better results actually when the bike is calibrating sitting on its own weight, because now it knows the zero position of a bike when it's on a free sack. And I took it, so I reset all the settings to 0 in terms of a DDC for all the modes, all reset it to factory default after that calibration, which I performed at the BMW dealership. And I just take a bike for a ride, and immediately I notice that I don't really need to do any changes. So everything in terms of a damping is set to 0. In the front, both compression and rebound. In the rear, both compression and rebound. And in all the riding modes, so slick, sport and race, everything seems to work fine, just as it is. So the front forks are not diving so much on the braking. So even like before installing the sensor, with a stock preload, if you brake hard, you would see that the zip tie goes down almost to the bottom. Right now it's much better than that, so the bike seems to be fine with the preload settings as they are. However, the sag in the front and in the rear are excessive, like some more than you would expect, you know, on a racing bike, like not racing, but like super sport bike like this. But I kept them there because the suspension right now with all the zeros everywhere works perfectly in all the modes. So the sport mode is the softest mode, but bike is still stable. It absorbs the bumps really well, really good for a street. I mean the sport DDC mode. The race DDC mode is a little bit harder, a little bit more stable, and the slick mode is the stablest of it all, but you can feel like a small hits through the suspension, which are not being absorbed. So good for racetrack, for very good racetrack, but not so good for the street. But the more stable mode is the slick mode. And that's it. So I think that's pretty much the holy grail of the thing. So you need to actually set it up correctly, use a front sensor, and calibrate the bike after that on the in your BMW dealership, because I think the bike still the same. So that the bikes they would come from the factory, not assembled in the right way, not with a swing arm, let's say bolts assembled, leakage bolts assembled under the load, when there's a weight applied to the rear swing arm. And that's it. So after that, bike works perfectly. So the front sensor is definitely a great addition. It improves the front performance dramatically. It's not even comparable to what it is without a sensor. And the rear works perfectly right now. So if you bought a bike used, somebody messed around with a rear suspension, something like that, you always, just first thing you do, just go to a BMW dealership and recalibrate it with all the preload taking off the rear shock spring. Your preload adjuster is located on the shock over here. That's a preload adjuster. So you screw it out completely, and then that's it. Recalibrate and everything will start to work perfectly. And that's it. I guess that's the end of my journey regarding the DDC suspension. So I went a full circle, trying to compensate for the problems with the front when there was no front sensor, with the geometry changes and so on and so forth, different preload settings, and I came down to what it was, or how it's supposed to be from the factory eventually, by this, let's say, the repair manual, and with a calibration of sensor, it becomes great under the bike's weight. And that's it. I think that's the last thing I can say about the DDC suspension. So it does work okay, or quite well, I would say. Again, if you want to do modifications to the bike geometry or anything like that, I would still say that you need a manual suspension, and I still think that the manual suspension will be better if you do serious racing, especially if you want to replace forks or fork cartridges or rear shock with Aucklands or B-tube or something like that. Because with the DDC, of course, you need to then do something about it, so you need to modify something to make it work. Because if you just unplug the shocks, the DDC will give you an error, and God knows how the rest of electronics of a bike would work because of that. There are solutions, but of course you can buy a calibration kit and disable the DDC through the calibration kit, but that's additional cost, and quite a lot. It's more than €1,000, so between 1,000 and 1,500, so it doesn't really make sense. So if you want to do serious racing, go buy the motorcycle like this without a DDC, with just a standard suspension, and then do whatever you like with it. With a DDC suspension, if you don't know anything about the suspension, if it's calibrated correctly, it works fine, but it not works as great as you can make a bike, or not so customizable, let's say, as if you would make a bike if you know something about the suspension with manual suspension adjustments and the geometry changes. So that's the conclusion. So DDC doesn't like any geometry changes comparing to a stock setup, but the logic is in there regarding the preload adjustment, or adjustment of like compensation for preload adjustment, compensation for rebound and compression damping adjustment. It doesn't really correspond to what you are like doing on the on the compression and rebound damping adjustment on the manual forks and shock. Especially on the rebound, you can feel it, so you never get the bike. If you even turn a whole, let's say, rebound damping to -7 front and rear, the bike will not float as it would do on the manual suspension. It would be kicking a lot. So it feels like a bike trying to extend the shock or forks too quickly when some logic kicks in and stops it. So you feel the initial like quick race, and when you stop, so it feels like sporadically kicking. Alright, so with a compression damping turned the other way around, the bike not really parking on the bumps as it would be with a manual suspension. It kind of tries to park and then releases. So again, it's not the same as on the, let's say, the manual adjustments. So that's the conclusion. So DDC works fine for those who have no idea on how to adjust their bike. Manual suspension for those who know what they're doing and they want like to do some customization to the bike. So thanks a lot. Hope it was useful, and bye.